In the previous video, we had discussed about the introduction to intermolecular forces. So in that, we had also discussed about what are polar molecules, what are non-polar molecules, and all of that is sort of important for you to understand the various types of intermolecular forces. The first one we're going to be learning about is dispersion or London forces. And these forces are shown by non-polar molecules or atoms. So non-polar molecules can be molecules like methane, molecular formula CH4, carbon dioxide, or atoms can just mean noble gases. So the reason we call them non-polar is because the electrons are not getting distorted, or basically the electron cloud is not disturbed. So let's assume we have two molecules A and B, and these are both non-polar in nature, which means their electron cloud is pretty even and it's evenly distributed and there's no issues. But then it was noticed that noble gases also can get liquefied. I admit that it's at extreme pressure and temperature, but it does get liquefied. So there have to be some amount of forces between these molecules, and that's why we have that's why we started with the whole intermolecular forces thing in the first place. So in this case, because so what happens is the molecule A, it has an electron cloud, and obviously has the nucleus in the center. So due to the motion of electrons, there might sometimes occur a condition where the electron density is higher on one side. So this will lead to the formation of something called the instantaneous dipole. So what is happening is there is a dipole forming for an instant due to the movement of electrons. Now, because A has an instantaneous dipole, forming in A, what happens is, if it gets pretty close to B, then there will be something called an induced dipole. See, the names are basically instantaneous and induced. Instantaneous is because of the electron cloud, and induced is because of the fact that A is having an instantaneous dipole. So because of that, there is a dipole which is getting induced in B. Now, when the electrons are moved to the right, then obviously our nucleus is getting displaced to the left. Then this would be these two cases are of the instantaneous dipole, whereas these two are of the induced dipole. So here obviously negative will attract to positive, so the nucleus will get displaced to the left. Similarly, here the electron is getting displaced to the left, nucleus is getting displaced to the right, and so the electrons of B is going to get displaced to the left. And this arrow depicts the the direction of the electrons. So obviously there has to be some term, or rather something, that determines the strength of such forces, and that is called polarisability. So polarisability basically means that if a particular atom is able to have the electrons displaced to one side and the nucleus displaced to the other, that is polarisability. And if a particular atom is able to polarize its electrons and the nucleus to a higher extent, then obviously the dipole will be higher, and so the dispersion or the London force will be higher. Okay, so polarisability is the ability of an atom to have the electrons displaced and the nucleus displaced to the other side. So obviously, since if you remember, I told you that B is going to get pretty close to A, and only then you have an induced dipole forming. So the distance has to be approximately 500, at least 500 picometer. Only then you have dispersion. Only then you have an induced dipole taking place, and only then you have the dispersion or London force. So we covered the distance, and we covered the the factor which determines the extent to which the forces are present. There's also something very important. This was actually given by a scientist, um, and he was the one who first studied, sorry, physicist. He was the first one to study these forces, and his name was Fritz London, and he called these forces London forces or dispersion forces. And more importantly, these forces are actually attractive in nature. So they attract each other. So A and B, there's an attractive force between A and B. That force is the dispersion or London force. Now the same thing can be the same kind of scenario. So here we said A and B is two different atoms. It can be between two nonpolar molecules as well. Now the forces are always attractive, and also one more important thing, the interaction energy is inversely proportional to the power, the distance to the power 6. Basically it means inversely proportional to 1 by r to the power 6, and r is the distance between the two particles, could be the atoms or molecules. Now they are only important for short distance, and they depend upon the polarizability. So in conclusion, you have two particles. First of all, dispersion or London forces was given by German physicist Fritz London. Here we are assuming two atoms A and B. A, due to the motion of the electrons or the movement of the electrons, there's something called an instantaneous dipole forming. And this instantaneous dipole will lead to the formation of something called an induced dipole in B. And because of the formation of these two dipoles, what happens is A and B attract each other, and this obviously depends upon the polarizability of these atoms. So polarizability, more is the ability for the atom to displace the positive and the negative, then more will be its dipole moment, more will be the dispersion or London force. Dipole moment as in instantaneous or induced, whichever. So the interaction energy is inversely proportional to the distance to the power 6, and this particular force is observed over short distances, and the distance is approximately 500 picometers. With that, we're done with dispersion or London forces. In the next video, we will be discussing about dipole forces.